to a different dialect. They worship the same gods. But the Macedonians did what the Greeks had never done for themselves. Philip came down, conquered the Greeks, united them all. Now, something else that made democracy have a bad name. When Philip came in, at least half the Greeks were in favor of Philip. They said, we're tired of these civil wars, we're tired of this fighting. Let's go ahead and agree with Philip. So half the Greeks wouldn't fight. A bunch of Greeks went around, including an orator named Demosthenes. Demosthenes, it was said he tried to improve his voice by speaking above the waves of the sea. He'd get on the ocean while the sea was roaring, he would try to speak. And he supposedly improved his voice. He also would put pebbles in his mouth, hoping that would give him more. But anyway, he would try to speak to a large crowd, urging the people to fight against Philip. Half of them said, well, I'm phooey on that. We'd rather have Philip than have war and chaos. So Philip came down and conquered. Now we're going to leave the political history for a while and get into their intellectual history, religious history and whatever. We'll start off with religion. The Greek gods. Start off with Uranus, Kronos, otherwise known as, the Romans called him Saturn. And finally Zeus, the Romans called him Jupiter. They believed that their gods lived on Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus had a constant cloud cover. In other words, the clouds never left the top of Mount Olympus. Now, the Greeks were not completely ignorant. I mean, they did climb Mount Olympus, but they knew, they pictured the gods as living in a spiritual realm outside the physical senses of ordinary humans. So they knew that if they climbed, that when they climbed Mount Olympus, they would not see the home of their gods. But they believed that these gods were immortal. They called them the blessed. There were no diseases among them, no death, no pain among them. These were the blessed people, the gods and goddesses lived there on Mount Olympus. Uranus came first, and if you look at the word Uranus, you see the word Anu. Uranus is the same as the Sumerian Anu. According to Greek folklore, Uranus had once ruled, but he had fostered rebellion among his sons, most notably Kronos, otherwise known as Saturn. The Greeks and Romans worshiped the same gods. So, anyway, Saturn, Kronos, overthrew Uranus, but Uranus then foretold his sons that your sons, just like you rebelled against me, your sons are going to rebel against you. So Kronos proceeded to swallow up his sons as they were born, including Zeus, Poseidon, otherwise known as Neptune, and Hades, otherwise known as Pluto. 3 of his sons, but in the meantime, one of Kronos' wives managed to give some kind of medicine to Saturn, but caused him to regurgitate his 3 sons. And they rose up in rebellion against their father and defeated their father. And but that ended the age of Saturn. Now, I want to state this: as the Romans, when they celebrated the particular day of the year called Saturn's Day, or Saturnia, it was a day when they had a lot of feasting and drunkenness, but it also was a day where the servants and masters changed places. The masters waited on the slaves, and the slaves, and of course, were waited on by their masters. I've read where that both the master and slave hated this ceremony, but I've also read otherwise that the slaves in particular liked it because it was a day that they got to sit down and be served by their masters. But it was saying that Saturn, to honor Saturn, you got to turn the world upside down because Saturn turned the universe upside down. The word Saturday comes from Saturn, and hopefully all of you know that the planets in our solar system have the names of the Roman gods, including Neptune, Pluto. Anyway, the three suns divided up the universe, with Jupiter getting the upper world, Poseidon, or Zeus got the upper world, Poseidon got the sea, and the netherworld, the underworld, the world of the dead, was put on by Hades, or Pluto. Now, the Greeks did not have much of a view of an afterlife. All that the people in Hades did was just have passed an aimless existence, did not talk, did not see, did not hear, maybe barely aware that they existed. Not much in the way of a happy afterlife at all. And this was one of the things that led to, it's believed to have led to the development and spread of Christianity that was to come later. There were a lot of other gods and goddesses. Zeus's wife was Hera, or we know of her in Roman times as Juno. The month of June was named after her. Saturday was named after Saturn, Saturn's day or Saturday. The sun god, Apollo. Ares or Mars, the god of war. Again, the Greek name, Roman name, so on and so forth. Oh yeah, the patron god of the Athenians was Athena, goddess of wisdom. The Romans called her Minerva. And if you go to a movie theater, oftentimes before they start to show a movie, they'll show a statue of a very thin version of Minerva. All right. Aphrodite, goddess of sex, love, and fertility. The Romans called her Venus. Mercury, he was the swift one. Again, if you look up in the sky, Mercury is the fastest moving of all the planets in the solar system, so he was the messenger god. He could move from constellation to constellation really, really fast. Problem is, you rarely see Mercury because it's so close to the sun. Venus, that's the brightest star in the heavens except for the sun and the moon. Venus, you'll see Venus, sometime you'll see Venus just before the sun comes up, or sometime you'll see Venus after the sun goes down. Right now, Venus is visible after the sun goes down. Do any of you ever see them? I mean, any chance?
If I was to look up at the sky, somebody would have to point at it.
Okay, you don't know which one's brighter than the other. Venus is very bright. Again, Venus was fast moving also. But Saturn was the old god because he was slow. He'd go across the constellations at night really, really slowly compared to the others. So he was the old god, and of course they did not know about, well, I say they did not know about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. There are persons who say that they did. Weirdly enough, Mars has two moons, Phobos and Deimos, dread and terror. Translate dread and terror. How did they know? I mean, according to the mythology, Mars had two servants. Their names were Dread and Terror. How did they know that Mars had two moons? When one moon is only 5 miles in diameter, the other one 10. As is the case of other people, they had stories of giants. The Titans were the giants of past days. And they had been defeated by Zeus and put in a very foul place called Tartarus. I'm not going to, I will write Titans on the board. Don't worry about the name Tartarus. The name Tartarus is mentioned one place in the New Testament book of Jude, where Jude says that fallen angels who sinned were cast into Tartarus also. The Greeks believed that Zeus had put the Titans in Tartarus. Maybe this different version of the same story. Now, the Greeks also had oracles. One oracle was the Oracle at Delphi. The oracle was the place where that you could get advice, particularly from the sun god. The oracle at Delphi was where you get advice from the god Apollo, or the sun god. Now here's the way that they did it. they had a priestess. Now, to become a priestess, they wanted to pick a very good woman, the best woman they could find that lived near the city of Delphi, to serve Apollo. Their idea of a good woman was a woman who was middle-aged, who had borne children, or a married woman, who had always been faithful to her husband, and whose children were seemingly well-behaved and well-orderly. They considered this as an example of good womanhood. And they would go in the community and search for the woman that best exemplified goodness and ask her to be the priestess of Delphi. And she would supposedly, when somebody went to ask her a question, a cloud would cover her. And she would get a message from Apollo, and then she would tell the person who came to visit her what she saw. Again, each of you can make up your mind for yourself what you believe about this. But weirdly enough, folks, the time came when these oracles stopped speaking. And if it had all been fakery or quackery, I've got to ask you, why did the messages stop? Again, each of you can figure that out based on your own worldview, your own theology. The other oracle was the oracle that Alexander the Great went to way down in the southern part of Egypt, deep in the desert. And this oracle was destined to tell Alexander the Great that he was a son of Zeus. The two oracles, both of them today, are fallen into ruins. Essentially, the oracles quit answering the people. Now, eventually the Greeks became skeptical of their gods. When they did, they started embracing new gods. They embraced the mystery religions, which I will talk about before in the chapter. And the Greeks and Romans alike began to embrace the mystery religions and also to embrace the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis. That name Isis will keep coming up throughout history. And if you watch the series on Smallville, you'll see that name Isis once in a while. Again, there are rumors that Isis has been worshipped all down through the ages by secret societies. That's difficult to prove. All right. But again, the Greeks, some of them at least, started questioning the existence of these gods, particularly as these gods seemed to communicate with them less and less. And for instance, the general whom the Greeks sent to fight over in Sicily, General Nicias, was a strong worshiper of the gods, very strong, and yet he was soundly thrashed and defeated. And this led the Greeks to, how could such a religious man who invoked the God's blessing on him be so soundly defeated? Again, all this was to lead the Greeks to become more and more skeptical as their armies that once would win battles started losing, as their armies were not able to handle Philip of Macedon. The armies that once handled the Persians could not handle Philip. And they began to be skeptical. All right, writing of history. The man who is credited with writing of history first is Herodotus. They do not count the Jews in the Jewish Bible, and there's a reason for that. Herodotus was hardly the first historian, but he was the first one to write history without a lot of reference to the supernatural, or by leaving out most of the references to the gods. In other words, he wrote secular history. Now, Herodotus wrote most of what we know about the Persian Empire, because the Persian records have been lost. See, the difference was between Herodotus and the Persians. Westerners kept copying Herodotus' history down through the ages, copying and recopying, and therefore Herodotus' history has been preserved. But Herodotus also wrote about the Egyptians, and he wrote about the pyramid, one of the earliest records we have of who might have built the pyramid and why. He told us that the Pharaoh who built the pyramid prostituted his daughter to help pay for the pyramid. And it took 20 years to build. Folk that had been laying a block every minute, day and night, to put those 2,300,000 blocks in place. I'm not saying they didn't, but anyway, that's what Herodotus tells us. But he wrote Egyptian history, and he wrote about the Hebrews, and some of what the Bible says in the Old Testament we'll find cross-referenced by Herodotus. A lot of Jews were living in Greece at the time. And Herodotus might have gotten some of his information from them and might have copied part of the Old Testament from the writings of the Jews who were living in Greece at the time. The Jews, once they returned from their Babylonian captivity, a lot of them became dissatisfied with living in Judea and scattered all over the Roman Empire. Believe me, I'm going to be talking about this when we come to the next chapter. This paved the way for the spread of Christianity that came later, because the Jews were living throughout much of the Roman Empire, even as early as the time of Herodotus. The next historian after Herodotus was Thucydides. He was even more secular than Herodotus by throwing out references to supernatural, references to giants and titans. Far less religious than Herodotus and more secular. All right. We'll go from the writing of history to the writing of drama, plays. Normally I don't emphasize plays much, but I've studied a lot of Greek history, so we'll emphasize particularly one play. The story of Oedipus. Now, the story of Oedipus involves fatalism and tragedy. Tragedy first. What is a tragedy when it is applied to literature? Yes?
Everyone dies.
At least where the hero of the story dies. Maybe not everyone, but at least the hero of the story dies. That's a tragedy. We're the main character. Now, before Oedipus was born, a soothsayer, a fortune teller, prophet, call him what you will, said, this man is going to kill his father. His father was a king, and marry his mother. Well, Oedipus, once he was born, he was ostracized, or rather kicked out of the community, not ostracized in the way that he was kicked out of the community, and he had no idea that his father was the king and his mother was queen. He grew up, led a rebellion against the king, killed the king, not knowing the king was his father, and married the queen, not knowing the queen was his mother. Again, he did all this because fate had willed it. And that's why we have the term, where we get the term Oedipus complex. Sigmund Freud coined the term. Now, again, this story has an example of fatalism because, and folks, don't go out of here saying I'm teaching this, I'm teaching about it. The idea of fatalism is we have no control over our destiny. Our destiny is all set for us, and there's nothing we can do about it. What will be, and we are helpless in the face of fate. The Greeks also believed in three fates. One of them got a person born, another one that cut a cord and ended his life. Third one that was his destiny while he was alive. But anyway, now a lot of these plays were tragedies. The Greeks would put on their plays in amphitheaters, and the amphitheater was constructed in such a way that if you stood at the right place, your voice would reflect off the amphitheater seats or walls, and you could be heard by hundreds of people without a public address system. Again, we have at the Science Center downtown a place where you can talk through it too and be heard all the way on the other side of the room by just talking in a normal voice and be heard easily, voice tube like. And I've been in the domes where you can talk even in a whisper and be heard by everybody under the dome because the shape of the dome reflects sound. Art. The most conspicuous part of Greek art was the temples. Now, Greek temples were open. They had a roof, but they had no walls. They were supported by columns. In other words, the temperature inside was the same as the temperature outside. The temple would protect you from the rain, but not from the cold or the wind. But every city had a temple, as did other cities in the Near East. And the temple was the home where the gods lived. Inside the temple would be a statue of their favorite god or goddess. And in Athens it was Athena. In Sparta it was Ares. And so on and so forth. All right. Now, their art strove for idealism, which is beyond, a little bit beyond realism. I used to teach that their art strove for realism, but now I've since read that their art actually was striving for idealism. To take the real and make the real even better than the real actually is. For instance, they was considered art successful if they could make a statue of an apple that was so real looking that a deer would come up and start licking the apple or trying to eat the stone apple. Because the apple was not only carved in the shape of an apple, but it was painted in such a way that it looked very real. So real that supposedly even an expert could not tell the real from the fake. Now today's artists do not strive for realism that much because we feel like our art should reflect what the camera can't pick up. In other words, leave realism to the camera. So instead, we use art to try to pick the surreal or something that's a little bit beyond realism, to depict emotion, feeling, or whatever. Now, particularly this was true when the Greeks made statues of their gods. When I was 11 years old, one of my classmates asked me, why do statues of the gods, or pictures of statues of the gods, always show them naked? Well, the reason for that is the Greek gods supposedly had the ideal body. The ideal body was a body of a male with broad shoulders and large biceps. The same type of body you see if you read the Superman comic books or go to see the Superman movie. They consider that the ideal, and of course I had one young girl at one time who's to say what the ideal body is, and have to agree. Now, where this becomes important later, Adolf Hitler tried to make his people into a race of Supermen, where that every man in Nazi Germany would look like a Greek god. Folks, this is an ideal that is impossible to achieve. Basically, where every woman would have an ideal perfect figure and every man the ideal. What we now know, all right, if you read the old comic books, there was a man named Charles Atlas who used to advertise that he could build your body to a perfect state of development. Again, I said he claimed he could. But he used what he called dynamic tension. We call it isometrics. Isometrics where you push against an immovable object and by so doing build up your muscles. Now today we know from our studies that muscles are better off built with motion and not with pushing against something. I mean, this was one of the exercises he did. There are about 1 million copies of his book still around. He sold for $5 a piece. But he would advertise. And the advertisement always included a before. And the before would be a man who was either too fat or too skinny. That was before. Then after. The after would be a perfectly developed man. Said, this man changed from this man over here to this man in a few weeks. I got a magnifying glass out one day to try to tell if the models were the same. And I later learned that no, they used different models for the before and another model for the after. The models for the two of them are not the same. And no, it is now known that unless you have the right genetic combination, you cannot transform your body into the body of a Greek god. Simply, most of us do not have that kind of a genetic combination. You have to have the right genes. You can work your muscles and build them up a little bit, but there are limits to how much you can build. All right. Now, turning to a subject I know a little bit more about. And again, folks, I have enough time to give you a real ride. Philosophy. Now, I'll start off with a sophist. The sophist believed that we will never understand the universe, that this understand belong human knowledge, and we should not try. I want to comment on that a little bit. Modern day scientists are pursuing what they call a TOE, T-O-E, which is a theory of everything. Albert Einstein called it the unified field theory. That one day we're going to come up with a theory that will explain every phenomenon in the universe. However, other scientists are still skeptical. They say there's some things about our universe that's just simply not going to be explained. Some things just, we don't know. And we never will know. Anyway, yes, something I want to tell you. The law of gravity works so well inside our solar system. It explains the movements of planets. We can plan to send a satellite, need to send a satellite to Pluto within the last year or so. Didn't land on Pluto, but it zoomed by it. Using the law of gravity. But the law of gravity does not seem to work beyond our solar system. Why is that? Well, first of all, what do I mean? I mean, the galaxies are held together by something, and it can hardly be gravity because there's just not enough gravity, according to our math anyway, enough gravity in the galaxies to hold them together. The galaxies should all start flying apart. They don't. Why don't they? We don't know. It's almost like there's different physics operating out there than there is here. Even though a scientist just assumes that physics is the same out there that it is here. But it's an assumption only. You cannot prove it. Anyway, whether or not we'll ever understand everything, they stressed rhetoric. Now I want to define rhetoric. In American history, there were two men who knew each other, even liked each other. I'm talking about Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. They were both from Virginia. Now, Patrick Henry, when talking about the King of England, says, "Our chains are already forged. You can hear the clanking of our chains on the plains of Boston. Is life so dear and peace so sweet to be purchased with chains?" That's rhetoric. Now, Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, wrote the Declaration of Independence and said, "He has abolished our legislatures. He has taken our people abroad to be tried where they have no one to speak for them. He has," and if you look at the Declaration, he has imposed taxes on us without our consent. He has imposed governors on us and without our consent and forced us to pay for these governors. He has imposed judges. But you see the difference between rhetoric? Rhetoric is where you try to stir up the emotion. Thomas Jefferson, factual. Here's what he has done, specifically what the King of England has done to us. And they're different, but the sophist stressed rhetoric, which is designed to stir up the emotion, stir up the adrenaline. Now, here's something now that some of you might take leave from me over. The sophists believed that there were no absolutes. Now, some of you might believe this, but I got to ask, yes.
I think it self-denies.
Well, for instance, is this an absolute?
Yes.
If it is an absolute, that there are no absolutes, then this being an absolute means that there are absolutes. At least there's one absolute. Now, I want to tell you something about Einstein's theory of relativity. He had two things in that theory that were absolute. The speed of light was absolute and time